For 715, the last lesson of this unit, we did a bit of review. We talked about the main causes of the war: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And then I asked you to review specific events and terms and figure out how do they relate to the initial causes. With the Sykes-Picot Agreement, this was the secret alliance or the secret agreement between Britain and France in 1916 that was already carving up the Ottoman Empire, planning ahead: when we win, we will secretly carve up this territory, when meanwhile T.E. Lawrence had been sent by the British government to work with local Arab groups and help give them independence if they would help the British. So you have two contradictory things happening. This would be a great example of alliances, these secret agreements, and also imperialism, that the British want what they want, especially they want the oil in the Middle East. The invention of the U-boat and the tank, they absolutely is militarism, building up the military, adapting technology to your needs so that you can be superior in the fight. The losses at Gallipoli, remember that was part of the Dardanelles campaign of fighting against the Ottoman Empire. Winston Churchill comes up with the plan for an amphibious attack, and is largely British and French troops, and many of the British troops are from Australia and New Zealand, those Anzacs. This would be another example of imperialism, that part of the reason Britain had so many troops was they were pulling from their empire. And then dehumanizing the enemy. Hopefully you're seeing in All Quiet on the Western Front that when these soldiers start to realize that the soldiers on the other side are just like them, it's actually quite disconcerting, that they don't understand why they're fighting. So that's why it's so important that governments continue propaganda that shows the enemy as inhuman, as a total threat to their way of life. So this would be about nationalism. So here is President Woodrow Wilson. We talked about him in the last lesson. He was in his second term of office. He was an academic, so he's very much a problem solver. He gets America into this war in April of 1917, and it does take a while for all of that to start, sort of the gears to start all working together and get the soldiers over to Europe. But in the meantime, he is trying to think of ways that when this war eventually ends, what can we do as an international community to make sure something of this magnitude ever happens again? So he proposes 14 ways or 14 things he thinks should happen, and it's called the 14-point speech. So this is January 1918. So this is directly from his speech. These were his words. He said, "Open covenants of peace, openly arrived at, after which there shall be no private international understandings of any kind, but diplomacy shall proceed always frankly and in the public view." He wants to make sure, he says, part of the reason this war started was the secret alliances. So if we don't want to repeat our mistakes, no more secret alliances. It's just not helpful for anyone. He also wants absolute freedom of navigation upon the seas, outside territorial waters, alike in peace and in war, except as the seas may be closed in whole or in part by international action for the enforcement of international covenants. He's saying, the international borders of a country extend 200 miles into the ocean. But he wants people to be safe even outside of that border. He wants freedom of the seas. This is in response to the unrestricted submarine warfare, that people of any nationality should feel safe to travel. 3, the removal so far as possible of all economic barriers and the establishment of an equality of trade conditions among all the nations consenting to the peace and associating themselves for its maintenance. This essentially means free trade. That if you are refusing to trade with another country because you don't like their religion or their ethnicity or the way they look, that's going to cause problems. So if we can create more free trade amongst all of the countries, that will help create peace. I will benefit because I'm selling you something and I'm getting paid. You'll benefit because you're now getting something that you need. And we'll work on that relationship together, and we'll be less likely to go to war because we are relying on each other. 4, adequate guarantees given and taken that national armaments will be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety. This means that these countries need to shrink their armies. Armaments means weapons, reduction of arms race, and this is important because with the militarism and the build-up to war, with everyone having huge militaries, They're going to be tempted to use them. Wilson is not saying get rid of the military, but only have the least amount necessary. 5. A free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. Lots of words, but this is about the empires. That all of these countries who were attempting to get an empire to prove their power, and in doing so didn't pay any attention to the native peoples, Wilson is suggesting that perhaps these imperial powers need to consider those people, that they need to listen to their desires, sort of a little inkling, a little hint of self-determination for the people living in the colonies. The evacuation of Russian territory and such settlement of all questions affecting Russia as will secure the best and freest cooperation of the other nations of the world in obtaining for her an unhampered and unembarrassed opportunity for the independence determination of her own political development and national policy, and assure her of a sincere welcome into the society of free nations under institutions of her own choosing. And, more than a welcome, assistance also of every kind that she may need and may herself desire. The treatment accorded Russia by her sister nations in the months to come will be the acid test of their goodwill, and their comprehension of her needs as distinguished from their own interests and of their intelligent and unselfish sympathy. That's a really large paragraph, so it must be about Russia. First part is that the territory that Russia had given to Germany, that belongs to Russia. That any spaces that Germany is occupying that should belong to Russia need to go back to Russia. Also, remember, the Russian Revolution had just happened, that the majority of the Russian people supported this new Soviet Marxist government. What Wilson is saying here is, we may not agree with Marxism, but this was chosen by the people, this self-determination, so that we need to respect that, and we need to honor the choices that the Russian people have made. 7. Belgium, the world will agree, must be evacuated and restored without any attempt to limit the sovereignty which she enjoys, in common with all other free nations. Essentially, leave Belgium alone. Poor Belgium was messed with. Germany takes a shortcut through her. And it's not that Germany just walks through, but the Germans rape and pillage Belgium. Plus, so many of the trenches were in Belgium. So Wilson sees that it's very important that Belgium be restored, that they apologize. And otherwise, there will be long-held grudges. Same thing with the French. All French territories should be freed and the invaded portions restored. And the wrong done to France by Prussia in 1871 in the matter of Alsace-Lorraine, which has unsettled the peace of the world for nearly 50 years, should be righted in order that peace may once more be made secure in the interest of all. So this is going back, this territory, Alsace-Lorraine. When Otto von Bismarck, who with realpolitik is going to take what he wants to prove that Germany is better. So in 1871, the Prussians attack France. They win the war, and they take this resource-rich territory in between Germany and France, Alsace-Lorraine. What Wilson is saying is that is France, that belongs to France, and if Germany continues to hold that territory, it will again create a grudge that will lead us to another war. 9. A readjustment of the frontiers of Italy should be effected along clearly recognizable lines of nationality. Again, this is about the people. If the people are speaking Italian and feel in their culture and their heritage they're Italian, then it should be part of Italy. If that's not the case, then it shouldn't be part of Italy. Those people should be able to choose their own type of system. 10. The peoples of Austria-Hungary, whose place among the nations we wish to see safeguarded and assured, should be accorded the freest opportunity to autonomous development. This is talking about all of those ethnic religious groups in Austria-Hungary. Think back to the Serbs and the Black Hand, the very first things we talked about in this unit. Again, self-determination, letting people choose what they want to do, who they want to be. Same thing here, this is another long one. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro should be evacuated, occupied territories restored, Serbia accorded free and secure access to the sea. Again, let the people choose their own governments. Also, notice that it mentions that Serbia should have access to the sea. This has to do with trade. If this free trade is going to happen, we need to make sure that these new countries or these new territories are able to participate in that process. For 12, again, voice is getting a little rough. So this is about Turkey, about, again, free trade, free travel through the Dardanelles to be able to go from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, as well as protection of minorities. This is sort of a reference to the Armenians that are certainly really, there's not really enough people to gain independence necessarily, but that people should be protected. Same thing here for Poland, where the Polish have a distinct culture. They have that nationality. If they want to be their own state, then that should be allowed. And again, access to the sea to allow for trade. All of the previous 13 encompassed by number 14 says the way we're going to make 1 through 13 happen is a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. So he calls this a League of Nations, that the only way to secure freedom and safety is to have this meeting. So the goal of this League of Nations is to make sure a war of this scale and magnitude never happens again. So I told you from the beginning, Germany loses this war, even though at times it seemed like it was a little touch and go. Here's how Germany loses. We talked earlier about Kaiser Wilhelm II, the leader of Germany, part of that royal family tree from Queen Victoria. He was all about compensating because his identity is to be the big, important guy. He really was just a figurehead, though, from 1916 on. The military, the generals are the ones truly running the country from 1916 onwards. So here we are, 1918, and everyone is just exhausted. In early November, there is a naval mutiny, meaning the sailors refuse to follow the orders of their commanding officers. And the news of this spreads, that the rest of the country starts hearing about part of the military that is just giving up, that they are no longer okay with fighting this war. And this becomes hugely popular throughout the civilians. There are protests in Berlin, stop the war, we're exhausted, we know we're going to lose. Public. Kaiser Wilhelm really has to consider his position. Now, he still technically is the king, he's the leader of Germany, just doesn't really do much. So he now sees, in the first week of November 1918, that his own country thinks this war was a bad idea. He sort of knows that the world at large feels this was a bad idea. And then also, a few months previously, he realized that his own family thought it was a bad idea. Remember that whole family tree? And King George V of England had changed the family name. Remember, they're all related to Queen Victoria, whose husband was Prince Albert from Germany. And so from then on out, the royal family of Britain, their last name was Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which is a very German name because Prince Albert was German. And so Queen Victoria's kids and her grandkids all had the last name Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. And so technically the King of England has a German last name, and by the middle of this war is so disgusted with Germany, so disgusted with his cousin, that he decides to change the entire royal family's name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor. And this is really when Wilhelm, all of this together, he realizes it's pointless. There's no reason for him to continue this charade that he has all this power when he doesn't. So he abdicates. He gives up power. He forfeits, and you just, what's the purpose? So this symbol, this man who had wanted to build up Germany, he now decides it's no longer worth it to continue fighting. Now, the thing about the military dictatorship is the generals had already begun discussing forfeiting, discussing giving up. 2 months previous, they had started negotiations with the Allies. So this is now in that same time when the Navy mutiny is going on, when the revolts in Berlin are going on, the Army leadership has started meeting with the Triple Entente, and they're meeting in this Pullman railroad car, and that's important later on. To just start talking about how are we going to end this war. They don't want to meet in the city, they want to meet in neutral territory. And then as they're meeting that first week of November, they get the news that the Kaiser resigned, that he abdicates. So the German negotiators, they see that as, this was the last symbol. This was the last holdout of hope that we still had this figurehead leader. We don't have that anymore. Great, let's end this war. So all sides agree to an armistice. Armistice is that same root word as arms, armaments. It just means put down your weapons, stop the fighting. Nothing else has been decided other than to stop the fighting. And that fighting will end on the 11th day of the 11th month on the 11th hour, 1918. So November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. And for many years this was known as Armistice Day because this epic moment when the war ends, when the soldiers stop fighting. Today we celebrate as Veterans Day because after World War II we had many veterans to consider. But this is an important moment. The war has ended. Now nothing else has been agreed upon except stop fighting. It's a pretty epic moment. All sides are thrilled because all sides are exhausted. The British do decide, however, to maintain the naval blockade just in case the Germans decide to get a little bit sneaky. So here we're looking again at these cousins, all related to each other through Queen Victoria. We've got Nicholas Romanov on the left, George V of England in the middle, and Kaiser Wilhelm on the right. Nicholas, you'll remember, he was killed as part of the Russian Revolution. King George remains king until 1936. It's a very long reign. And then I actually think Kaiser Wilhelm sort of got the best deal. Once he abdicates, he sort of fades away into oblivion. He spends the rest of his life in exile, never returns to Germany. He spends it in Belgium, of all places, just sort of this quiet old man reading in his garden, which for me I think is very odd that Germany gets blamed for this war, but the man who is blamed has no punishment. So I sort of think he got the best deal out of all of it. So we got to talk about the cost of the war. Economics are certainly part of it. In one way, it was a hugely important time for technology. And all of the new weapons that were created or adapted, the scale of production and business, this was hugely important on all sides. Here we see a shell factory. So this was important for the German economy leading up to the war. But as the war went on and on and on, it got more and more expensive. So 4 years after this war begins, most sides are in debt of some sort or another. In Britain, even in America, and especially in Germany, this debt is astronomical. Even Britain had billions of pounds of debt. At the time, that's around 8 billion. It's about $70 billion worth today. And that's just in 4 years. Germany had just slightly more debt. Even though the war is over, governments are still going to suggest to their citizens, buy war bonds, buy savings bonds. Give the government cash now, and we'll pay you back later because we need to pay down this debt. And in Germany particularly, there is massive, massive inflation, meaning the value of the money decreases. Here you see children in the 1920s, their play bricks are made out of stacks of cash. But this guy here is wallpapering with bills. So this economic devastation in Germany will play a huge role in the next unit. Then there is the costs. They're the costs that you can't necessarily put a number on, can't put a price on. The dynasties in Europe that have been in power for so many years that no longer existed. We have the Hohenzollerns. We've got the Habsburgs in Austria, the Romanovs, and even the entire Ottoman Empire. That all of these power structures ceased to exist with the ending of this war. I mean, it's hard to put a price on the cultural, historical heritage of these families and systems that had been in place for centuries. And when these systems no longer exist, the people do have the chance at self-determination. They get to decide what they want, but that's not always an easy process. They want freedom, but they also don't know how to obtain it or how to maintain it. So this will cause some chaos in the 1920s and 30s. Regardless of what side you were on, there was a sense of a shared trauma that, as awful as it was, everyone experienced it together. That the number of dead, the impact of this war was something that no one was able to escape, which is also part of the reason why there are new ideologies that become increasingly popular. The first is pacifism, that just war must be avoided at all costs, that peace must be maintained because we can never again repeat this horrific scale of war. There's nihilism, which is a much more depressing version that just says that, nothing is worth anything. Life is pointless because look at the evidence that for 4 years these countries had tried to annihilate each other. So what is the purpose of life? Just do whatever you want. None of it matters in the end anyways. And then we have internationalism, this sense that if countries could just get along, if they could just talk, then wouldn't that be great? They could avoid war. They could avoid repeating these same mistakes. And then last, we have the casualties. This is one of the few times we can put a clear number on it. We have military deaths. Now look at the difference between the Triple Entente and the Central Powers. Triple Entente lost far more soldiers, but remember they had Russia with all of those people. They had the British Empire with Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, India, all of their territories that they controlled. So we have nearly 10 million soldiers killed. Then we have the wounded, again, higher for the Triple Entente, much higher, significantly higher, and that is likely due to, at least at the beginning of the war, the Germans' technological superiority. And also because the Triple Entente had more soldiers to begin with. Keep in mind that these figures do not include shell shock. These only include trench foot, getting bullets, having your leg blown off by a shell, but not shell shock. So we have no sense of the number of soldiers who were truly impacted by this war. And what we often forget is that civilians aren't necessarily safe in wartime, either due to their village being taken over or becoming part of the war zone, or lack of supplies and poor nutrition leading to starvation in many cases. So overall, this was an extremely devastating war, and it becomes very apparent why everyone wants to avoid repeating these same mistakes again.